Welcome. In this video, we'll be taking a look at how to solve quadratic equations. So quadratic equations, the way they're different from the equations we've solved so far is they have an x squared in them. And that's really the highest power of x that we see. So we've solved equations with just x's before, but we've really never solved equations where there's an x squared. And so the first step in the process is to get all of your terms on one side. So we're going to take a look at this one as an example. And so our first step is to get all of our terms on one side. Well, what I see over here is since I have a -4, to get rid of that, to get all of my terms on one side, I'm actually going to add 4 to both sides. And so what we're left with is 5x squared minus 21x plus 4, and on the other side, -4 and 4 make 0, so we're left with 0. So mission accomplished for step 1. Step 2, well, notice what I'm left with on the left-hand side. I'm left with an expression of 3 terms, an x squared, an x, and just a plain old number. That looks really juicy for factoring. So I'm going to factor for step 2. And so if you haven't watched the videos on factoring a trinomial, go back and watch those because I'm going to be using that knowledge to do this. So we've got 5x squared minus 21x plus 4 equals 0. So I'm just going to multiply my two outside guys together. So that's 20. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply together to be 20 and at the same time add together to be -21. And so, well, if they're going to multiply together to be a positive, but then add together to be a negative, I know we're looking for two negative numbers. So -20 and -1, I think are going to do the trick. So then what I'm left with is 5x squared minus 21x plus 4 equals 0. And so I've just found out how to break up the -21x. I'm breaking that up using my key numbers. So I've got -20x minus 1x, and then everything else stays the same. So I've got plus 4, and I've got 5x squared, and I know that this is all equal to 0. So then if I use my grouping technique, well, the first guy, I can factor a 5x out of both of those terms, and I'll be left with x minus 4. For the second group, because there's a minus sign in between, I'm going to factor out a minus, and then 1 is the greatest common factor, so I'll be left with x minus 4 here. And again, the reason why it's x minus 4 is because -1 times -4 gives me the positive 4 that I started with. And so my factoring answer is going to be x minus 4 times 5x minus 1 equals 0. So if I'm trying to solve this, I've really got one step left. So what I want you to notice is that I'm multiplying two things together, and then look at my answer. My answer is 0. Well, if you're multiplying two things together and your answer is 0, there's only really one way that that can happen. Actually, there's 2 ways that can happen, 3 ways that can happen. If you multiply and get an answer of 0, that means either your first number is 0, your second number is 0, or both of your numbers are 0. That's the only way that you can actually get an answer of 0 using multiplication. So what that means for step 3 is we're going to set each factor to 0 and solve. And so we've got x minus 4 times 5x minus 1 equals 0. So I'm going to take this first factor, which is x minus 4, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. And then I'm going to take the second factor, which is 5x minus 1, and set it equal to 0. And I'm going to solve each one. So if I solve the first one by adding 4 to both sides, I'll have x equals 4. That's one solution. If I take the second guy and solve it, add 1 to both sides, I get 5x equals 1. Divide both sides by 5, and that gives me x equals 1/5. That's a second solution. So when I have a quadratic, a lot of times I'm going to get two unique answers, two answers that actually both work. Now let's see why they work again. So if I plug 4 in for x, notice what I'd have here. I'd have 4 minus 4, which is 0. And I don't even care what the second group is, because I know that 0 times whatever I get here is going to be 0 for an answer. If I do the second one, try it. Well, if I plug 1/5 in for x, 5 times a fifth is 1, and 1 minus 1 is 0, and 0 times anything is going to give me 0. So both of these answers work. Okay, I want you to try number 3. Pause the video and then restart it after you've given it a try. So for number 3, again, the first step is we need to get all of our terms on one side. And I always like to have my squared term as positive. So what I'm going to do is subtract 11z from both sides. And I'm also going to add 5 to both sides. So if I do that, on the left-hand side, I'll have 2z squared minus 11z plus 5. And on the right-hand side, I've got 0. Now the next step is to factor. So if you factor this guy, I'm actually going to skip a few steps, but if you go through the factoring process, you should end up with 2z minus 1 and z minus 5. Okay, then from there, what you should do is set each individual factor equal to 0. So that leaves 2z minus 1 equals 0, and z minus 5 equals 0. And so the answer for the first one, well, we've got 2z equals 1 if we add 1 to both sides. And if I divide both sides by 2, we get z equals 1/2. So that's one answer. And then the other one, if we add 5 to both sides, we get z equals 5 as our second answer.